There were four specific apocalypses we were exposed to every day: environmental collapse, climate catastrophe, population explosion, nuclear annihilation. Four different endings, all of them aimed at 12-year-olds. These weren't fringe ideas. These were the ambient atmosphere of growing up in a specific decade. And if you came of age during that window, you absorbed all of it, whether you wanted to or not. Let's start in 1971. That's when a commercial aired on American television that lodged itself in a lot of minds. A Native American man paddles a birch bark canoe down a river clouded with industrial waste. He steps ashore onto a landscape buried in litter. He walks to the side of a highway, and someone in a passing car throws a bag of garbage at his feet. As the camera zooms in, he turns toward us and we see a single tear rolling down his face. Remember that? The Crying Indian PSA, put out by the nonprofit Keep America Beautiful, was one of the most recognized public service announcements in American broadcast history. Now, what most people didn't know at the time is that Keep America Beautiful was funded largely by Coca-Cola, Anheuser-Busch, and the major packaging corporations, the same companies whose disposable containers were filling those rivers and roadsides. We cried along with that commercial, and many of us came away believing that littering was the central environmental problem, while much larger industrial pollution issues received far less attention. Hey, that's not ancient history. That was the first environmental lesson most Jonesers ever received. That environmental message, well, at least it was pointing at a real problem. Some of the other things we were told to worry about didn't quite pan out. April 1975. You pick up a copy of Newsweek at the drugstore, and right there on page 64 is an article that stops you cold. The Cooling World. That wasn't fringe. That was a national news magazine. And Newsweek wasn't alone. 2 months later, Time magazine published an article titled Another Ice Age. Similar stories appeared in several newspapers that year. The Guardian ran a story stating that a new ice age was coming fast. Scientists were watching a multi-decade temperature trend, and some of them were saying it out loud. A new ice age might be coming. Science writer Nigel Calder said the approaching cooling, directly quoting, must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery in the coming decades. Look, this one is different from the Crying Indian PSA. Nobody funded this fear. It wasn't manufactured. It was honest science grappling with incomplete data, the same scientific process that would eventually point in the opposite direction. For a brief, genuine moment, it pointed the other way. You were 12. You didn't know the difference between a preliminary study and a settled consensus. You just knew the planet itself might be turning against us. A Stanford biologist named Paul Ehrlich published a book that sold over 2 million copies, The Population Bomb. His opening line, the battle to feed all of humanity is over. Not we're falling behind, not this is getting difficult, over. He predicted mass starvation on a civilizational scale, hundreds of millions dead in the 1970s and 1980s, basically in your lifetime. Yeah, that didn't quite materialize. In fact, the world is now grappling with the opposite problem: collapsing birth rates across Japan, South Korea, Italy, Germany, a lot of places. The demographic conversation today isn't about who's going to starve, it's about who's going to be born. But in 1968, in 1972, in 1975, when you were absorbing all of this through magazines and school and dinner table conversations, it felt like an oncoming wall. The math was right there on the page. More people, same planet. What were you supposed to do with that? By the time you hit middle school, duck and cover drills were already starting to feel absurd.
He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
You knew.
He did what we
Everyone
all
knew.
must learn to
Hiding under a
do.
desk wasn't going to do much against a thermonuclear device. The whole exercise had almost polite dishonesty to it, like the adults were going through motions they didn't believe in either, because the alternative was admitting there was nothing to be done. The Cuban Missile Crisis was only 10 years in the rearview mirror. In 1962, it had come down to 13 days, 2 men, and 2 buttons. Both sides still had enough warheads to end civilization many times over. That number wasn't classified, it was on the evening news. It was in the encyclopedia your school library had on the shelf. You didn't walk around thinking about it every day, but it was in the background. It was part of the air. The Soviets could end everything before breakfast, and they might. We should be happy if all we got out of that was a few lines on our foreheads. I was born in 1959, which puts me squarely in the middle of all of this. I remember watching that Crying Indian commercial and feeling it, really feeling it. I didn't know until years later that the whole thing was engineered by the beverage industry to redirect blame. At the time, it was just the world telling a kid to pay attention, that things were fragile, that the adults hadn't handled everything perfectly, and that somehow it was now partly on us. That's a strange message to deliver to a 12-year-old, but that was the message. There's real research now on chronic stress and background anxiety during childhood in the formative years. Psychologists call it background stress, not traumatic events, but persistent low grade environmental signals that something is wrong. The threat is possible. The world is not entirely safe. So, what does it tend to produce? Not necessarily anxiety disorders, more often heightened vigilance, sharper pattern recognition, a finely calibrated skepticism about official reassurances. Jonesers and Gen X developed a kind of institutional immunity that their parents' generation, raised on post war confidence, never quite had. When someone today tells you everything is fine, there's a part of you that learned very early to wait and see. That's not damage, that's data. Here's the pattern if you're keeping score. The Ice Age didn't come, the population bomb didn't detonate, the Soviets didn't launch, and check this out: the Crying Indian was an Italian American actor from Louisiana, and his tear was made of a drop of glycerin on his face. A lot of the threats we were warned about either didn't materialize in the way we expected, or they arrived on a very different timeline, or they turned out to be far more complicated than the headlines suggested. Jonesers and Gen X became the generations least impressed by institutional authority, least likely to take a headline at face value, most likely to say, that sounds alarming, let's wait and see. That's not cynicism, that's a skill. one that we learned before we even had a driver's license. Every generation gets shaped by the ambient atmosphere of its coming of age years. The silent generation got post-war relief and quiet conformity. The early boomers got idealism and expansion. We got something different. We got apocalypse on a rotating schedule, a new catastrophe every season, delivered by television, accepted as the background noise because it was the only background we knew. And it left marks, of course it did. But a generation raised on fear that never fully materializes doesn't become a generation of fearful adults. It becomes a generation with very good sensor for distinguishing real threats from manufactured ones. The wellness industry is now selling people the ability to sit quietly with themselves and not freak out over things outside of their control. There's an app for that. There are coaches for that. There are retreats in the mountains for that. Jonesers and Gen X got that lesson for free in the 7th grade from a television set and a man in a canoe. These worry lines are not evidence of a fragile generation. They're the record of a generation that was handed an unreasonable amount of ambient dread at a formative age, processed it without a therapist or self-care industry, and came out the other side with the resilience that a lot of people are now paying good money to try to develop. We didn't call it mindfulness. We just called it Tuesday. So I want to know, what's the fear from your childhood that stuck with you the longest? The one that felt most real, most inevitable, and then either never happened or happened completely differently than you'd been told? Drop it in the comments. And if you stayed with me this far, do me a favor, hit the hype, like, and subscribe buttons. Consider it your small contribution to the permanent record of things we were afraid of that turned out not to kill us. Here's the thing about worry lines. They're not a sign that the world broke you. They're a sign that you took it seriously, watched it carefully, and kept showing up anyway. That's not worry, that's wisdom. It just lives on your face now. Thanks for watching.